All right, South Africans have been facing a higher cost of living and resultantly higher interest rates. Inflation, or the rate at which prices are rising, reached 7% this week. The Reserve Bank targets a range of between 3 and 6%. Now, that means another interest rate hike is on the cards when the bank's Monetary Policy Committee meets next week. Around the world, prices for daily necessities like food and fuel have been rising. It's been up and down, but eventually or mostly impacted by the war in Ukraine. South Africans have already been subjected to 8 consecutive interest rate hikes over the last year and a half. To discuss, we're now joined by Senior Economist at PWC Strategy, Xhanti Payi. Xhanti, great to have you with us as always. I was hoping that we could start talking about when interest rates will start coming down, and there was a sense that maybe that was a possibility on the horizon. But now, do you agree we're set for another interest rate hike?
Well, I'm glad that you were the first one to break the bad news about whether or not that is on the cards, and I just have to give some of the background. And I think one of the key problems, of course, of just what you've just mentioned, this surprise increase in inflation. There's, of course, also what we heard earlier this morning or yesterday from the U.S. Federal Reserve, that they were also increasing interest rates on that side, which, of course, is something that usually causes a lot of concern and interest in the South African authorities. So it really is looking like, given everything that we see, especially the challenges that are faced by consumers at this moment, that is likely on the cards.
So the predictions are a 25 basis point increase. That would take the repo rate up, and I think the prime lending rate to 11%. How stretched are indebted South Africans now that they are going to be stretched further?
That's certainly the level that we had for this year was 7.5 as PWC, so we're hoping that that's the highest that we will see. Consumers are really stretched. We saw this morning, actually this very morning, consumer confidence numbers came out. That would be the BER, FNB, Consumer Confidence Index, saying that actually the confidence is so low that it's back at the levels we saw during the lockdown. So that first quarter after the lockdown, which was the second quarter of 2020, that's how bad things are. We've seen, of course, also retail sales have also deteriorated. Consumer incomes are low, and we know, of course, the issue around growth in the last quarter. So consumers are going through quite a lot of difficulties, and also even just incomes, consumer incomes, real incomes have come under a lot of pressure. So that's really the pressure that unfortunately we are all facing.
So high interest rates, the Reserve Bank seeing growth of 0.3%. That's almost nothing. Does this count as the dreaded stagflation?
That is exactly what it is. I mean, I think also I think you might have seen also the IMF coming out and saying, well, this is 0.1%. So really, we are seeing, these high rate prices and low growth. And I think this is what the Reserve Bank is really concerned about. Remember, if this situation continues where you see inflation being so entrenched that actually people expect inflation to remain high, then people will start to, demand higher wages. That, of course, fuels inflation, because it first goes into producers and then comes back again into prices. So certainly that is probably one of their biggest worries, is that then this kind of inflation at these levels becomes entrenched, and then we are not able to bring it down. Yeah. And that, of course, will have devastating effects over the long period.
I think you used the word shocking or alarming for the 7% inflation. Tell me why. And there seems to be a discrepancy. So around the world, there's been a concern about the increase in the cost of living. But here particularly, we're worried about food. And it looks like prices soared until February. But then I saw that internationally, prices dropped in February. So we look out of sync with the rest of the world when it comes to food, which is very important.
Yeah, certainly. We were reading actually a report from one institute who actually handles this very well. And one of the things he mentions is that, of course, we just came out of a very difficult period in terms of our patterns. We know that the pressure that are faced by the agricultural sector, weather patterns have actually created the kind of situation that we have. We know that the price pressures that they've faced since the conflict in Ukraine and Russia around the inputs such as fertilizer. So, and then of course they are facing other pressures. We also know that, you know, feed has been expensive, and I suspect also one of the things that is probably going to come through, or has been coming through, has certainly been the constraints around electricity. Whether you're thinking about meat, in particular chicken. So that is probably one of the key things that we also are looking at if we are going forward. I mean, the expectation there is that this kind of inflation goes down maybe in the second quarter. So that will be another thing, right? Because if it takes us another 2 quarters perhaps to come down, the Reserve Bank will worry that then we will start to expect that inflation will continue to be high. And therefore, they must do something to assure us that they are actively working towards controlling this inflation.
All right, so we have our own peculiar woes adding to the suffering here. But finally, how much of what is happening sort of fits into the global picture and is linked to the war in Ukraine, which means that until that's sorted out, we remain in trouble, right?
Yes, I mean, I think that, you know, we have to understand the issues of value chains, and certainly some of the constraints that South Africa continues to face. I think one of the things that are important also to recognize, which the Reserve Bank is worried about, is that part we call core inflation, which is really outside of the food and the energy. Remember, we still have these ESCOM tariffs still to come through into the system. But there's certainly, you know, that the part of the inflation that we import, because we are such big importers of goods, and so that import bill, which is obviously on the back of the weakening exchange rate, which all of us have seen, is probably another concern. And they've certainly highlighted that they are worried about the very core inflation, so the stable part of the inflation that does not move as much as energy and food does. And even that seems to be of concern, because obviously a lot of it we still import. And so they are still worried about that because of the exchange rate. So there are all these factors. And I think really at this time, one of the big things that is very difficult is decision making, right? Because we certainly, if you want to make a decision between the difficulties the consumer has, the growth that we are seeing, and at the same time managing inflation, it must be an incredibly difficult time. I certainly think that, of course, for consumers, for businesses, and certainly for regulators.
Yeah, difficult all round. And if you have a home loan or a car loan, it's going to be ouch. Next week, when the Reserve Bank is expected to increase interest rates again. Thank you very much, Xhanti Payi, Senior Economist at PWC Strategy.